It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about, it's not just a movie review, but really actually how to watch this movie. Also, the movie's called A Hidden Life, and here to talk about it from the Grotto Network is Josh Noem. Thanks for being here, Josh.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Good to have you. Thanks for stopping by our South Bend studio. The movie, I actually hadn't heard about it really until saw your review, and then I watched the trailer, and looks amazing. Did you know the story of this before watching the film?
I had heard of the story of Franz Jaeger before, and I have some friends who are involved in the Catholic Peace Fellowship. Of course, his witness of conscientious objection is really important for their work, and so I'd run across his story through them. But I was really pleased to see that it was picked up by Terrence Malick as the subject for this film. Which
he's not Catholic, but there's a lot of Catholic stuff in the film. He didn't seem to remove it from what I can tell by the trailer and stuff.
No, that's right. And, Franz was a Catholic and living in a small village in the Austrian Alps. And the vestiges of that faith life are very apparent in the film. He was a sacristan in his parish, and he goes to the church and his parish priest and bishop for guidance in making his decision. And so that's very much an active backdrop to the film.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the story, and without, I guess, giving too much away? You talked about in your review that it's not a typical action film. You know, don't look for this being an Avengers blockbuster style.
That's right.
It's a long film, 3 hours, and maybe slower pace than what we might be used to.
Totally. That's exactly right. Terrence Malick is infamous for these kinds of films. He just is operating in a different wavelength. So it's really important for viewers to know what they're getting into as they go into this film. It's totally worth seeing, but just they have to be geared up for what to give to this kind of a film. I recently heard a talk by Paul Schrader, and he was a screenwriter, and helped direct Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. He works with Martin Scorsese. Innovated this style of filmmaking called transcendental style. And the idea is it's a style of filmmaking that gives the viewer time to contemplate and think. So Terrence Malick is not interested in kind of keeping you strung along with entertainment and fast moving action plots. He's going to, if a person has to move from point A to point B, in an Avengers movie, you start at A and then you cut to B because you're saving time and you're going with the action.
Right.
Terrence Malick is going to show you every single step from A to B, and he's giving you time to think and ponder and reflect and contemplate as that action happens. And he's giving you cues throughout the film, visual cues, things to think about. And the effect is that he's creating this vision with you. So you get the chance to feel, along with Franz Jaeger, the story, and not just receive it, not passively receive it.
Which I feel like that's almost a spiritual lesson in and of itself, that world's going 100 miles an hour, and we can go from one thing to the next and fill ourselves with all kinds of busyness and content and music and whatever. But we're called to, as Catholics, to slow down a little bit and take those times to think and to pray and have times of silence. So I mean, he's almost teaching a spiritual lesson in the format of the film.
Oh, for sure. And I came away from the film feeling like I'd been on retreat. And it's a rare piece of art that can do that can kind of put you in that space. But yeah, it's effective. There's a moment of dialogue where Franz is in a church and he's speaking with an artist. This artist is painting a fresco in the church. It's the only time that the artist shows up. And reading between the lines, my interpretation is that's Terrence Malick kind of inserting himself or his artistic voice in the film. And the artist is talking about his work and the role of art. And he says, most art creates admirers, and he longs to create art that creates followers. And I think that's what this film does. I think it's a step in creating followers because it's giving the viewer a chance to kind of walk this journey. It's a story about someone forming their conscience, but our consciences are being formed alongside Franz.
Yeah, can you dig more into that? What are some of the themes and actually some of the history? We haven't even talked about Nazis and things like that.
Yeah, right. So the whole backdrop of the story is World War II, and Franz Jaeger is a farmer in a really small farm in a village in the Austrian Alps. And he's married and has 3 young daughters, all under the age of 5 or 6. He has an elderly mother living with him. And I think a sister comes to live with them. But, a large part of the film is just kind of taking in the rhythms of small farming village life. You're in the public square with people and as they're drinking beers in a festival, and you're out in the fields with hand tools, harvesting grain and working with oxen. And I mean, it's kind of quotidian and depicts daily life in that sense. And in the middle of all this rhythm of family life and farm life comes the Third Reich, and news kind of filters into the town, and Franz is called up to serve in the army, and he undergoes a little bit of training, but along the way is starting to form his conscience, and because he's a farmer, he gets some allowances to be able to go back home. When he's called up again, he refuses to take an oath of loyalty to Hitler. It's a moving scene. There's a lineup of people, and they're all swearing their allegiance, and Franz remains silent, and he's taken aside and put into jail immediately. And so the rest of the film is him kind of wrestling with this position. He's refusing to cooperate with this regime, and it shows him in conversation with the church, in conversation with villagers, with his wife. And it does a really good job of revealing the kind of the interior struggle and discernment process that he uses to confront this vision of what it means to live as a person of integrity and to hold to a vision of truth that you hear in your heart.
What do you think was the most powerful thing about the movie?
That's a really good question. I wrote about this for Grotto Network, and I'm also writing about a different angle about it for a blog that we have with the U.S. bishops on four-year marriage. And that vision, the kind of line that I'm raising in that post is about his relationship with his wife. And that was a high point of the movie for me. His wife visits him when he's in prison. And obviously she doesn't want him to suffer, to face death because of this choice. Mm-hmm. But she also wants him to be who he is fully and to hold to the truth. And those two things are in conflict, but the courage it took for both of them to kind of not follow the easy answer and to stick with something that's really difficult and to stick together through all of that. It was really moving. And that encounter in prison was an emotional high point for me in the film. And it reflected something that I think is true about married life when you're facing a major decision with a spouse. You kind of circle around it and talk about it from different angles and try to surface what the deepest values are for each of you. And that's very much what kind of happens here. And it's a moving witness to kind of see how they continue to love each other and wrestle with the truth and seek it together.
We're talking with Josh Noem from the Grotto Network about the movie A Hidden Life. You can check out his review. And like I said, it's not really just a review, but also kind of a suggestion on how to watch the film. You can check it out at grottonetwork.com. And can you give us a little insight there? What should somebody do to prepare for a film like this?
Yeah, well, on a very physiological level, don't go to this movie when you're tired or like after a big meal. I think for listeners of this program, think about it as a retreat. It'll serve you well if you go in thinking about and prepared for the kind of contemplative approach that this film is going to ask of you. Yeah, it's a deeply prayerful film, I think. Not in a devotional way, but it really opens up a rich interior life that it took for Franz to live with such integrity. So just be willing to kind of walk along with that and to give something to this film. Know that it's not going to spoon feed you things that it wants you to think. It's going to present something that's really difficult. And the other beautiful thing about this film, Franz was beatified in 2007 by Pope Benedict. And, that's the thing about the lives of the saints, right? They stand out as kind of prickly witnesses and they call us to something different. It's not an easy thing that he did. And it cost him something very dear. And that's why we have the saints. They show us a different way to live. They show us something true and they call us to something more. And so, yeah, I think if you're going into this film, be ready to kind of examine what that more is and be willing to wrestle with it yourself.
What do you think drew somebody like Terrence Malick to this film and decided to keep it so Catholic?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have insight into what drew him to tell this story now. I think there are significant questions. I can hazard a guess, but I think there's significant questions about the role of conscience and cooperation with the state. Those are all difficult and deeply moral arrangements that we have in our lives. And those are questions that are coming to the fore. They've always been a part of American public life in the way that Catholics find themselves situated. We belong to two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And so there may be something about this story being told now in this current climate. I'm not sure. I think it's a rich story though. And that's kind of what engaged me about it, is just the way that it's rare to find a film that reveals such a rich interior life in such a palpable way that allows you to feel, not just receive or think, but actually feel kind of the movements that go along with it.
I was watching through the trailers and read a little bit about it, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of Schindler's List, which has been over 20 years since I watched it. But it was one of those movies that was very hard to watch, but also very important to watch. This one, it doesn't seem like it might be as hard to watch as Schindler's List. How would you compare the two?
No, I think that's right. Schindler's List leaves a very definite mark in the imagination and in an important way, right? It accomplishes an important role in terms of making the Holocaust come alive in people's imaginations in a real visceral way. This doesn't have quite the same end. The struggle is very much within Franz and within his family and his relationship with his wife and the village. And you kind of see the social cost, the way they're ostracized. He goes to prison and his wife is left to deal with the farm and the farm work, which is, very grueling work. So it's slightly, the scope of this is a little bit different, but his life is endangered because of this, and that becomes a very real thing as well. So I wouldn't say quite as gory or as the difficulties that the Holocaust present aren't the same difficulties here. But similar things to wrestle with. I mean, when you talk about your cooperation with some kind of a regime like this, and that's the same thing that Oskar Schindler dealt with too, right? He faced this regime, and he had to come to terms with his cooperation with it and what he was going to do, how a moral person would respond in such a situation. And that's the very question that Franz answers.
Well, thank you so much for writing this review, and it got me excited about it. So I definitely want to see it. It's called A Hidden Life is the movie. And then also you can check out Josh's review over at grottonetwork.com. You're the senior editor there. What else is going on with Grotto Network, or what should people check out?
Yeah, we are telling stories about living life boldly, and it's a fascinating project. I've been there just over a year. Grotto it's an evangelization resource. We're trying to help the church find language and ways to accompany people, especially young adults, in the digital world. So, we're interested in the world of faith, but in Catholic tradition, but we're also interested in translating that for people who are on the outside, which means we lead with human stories and values. We're trying to illumine the interior life, which is exactly why this movie was right in our wheelhouse. We just couldn't miss the chance to bring to the attention of our readers. So really grateful for the opportunity to speak about it with you.
Yeah, and just looking at the front page, you've got like choosing family over football. You've got an article on minimalism, one on wardrobe things that men should have in their closet, reading the Bible, and how to work out in the cold, like practical things, spiritual things. A lot of great resources there, so people can check that out. grottonetwork.com. And again, the film we were talking about is A Hidden Life. So thank you so much, Josh Noem, for joining us and share it with us.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks very much.